Let's start, though, with our top political story. For the second time this month, Canadians are facing the prospect of a snap federal election. The Liberals and the opposition Conservatives are sparring over a proposal to create a committee that would investigate misspending and ethical lapses during the pandemic. MPs will vote on that tomorrow, and the Liberals say they'll make it a confidence vote. For more on why, I'm joined by Pablo Rodriguez, the government's House Leader. He's in the foyer of the House of Commons. Hi, Minister Rodriguez. Good to see you, as always.
Hello, Vashi. Thank you for inviting me.
Minister, the Conservatives did end up changing their opposition motion this morning. They dropped the reference to corruption. Instead, they say that they want to establish a special committee on, quote, allegations of misuse of public funds by the government during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. Why does that require a confidence vote?
Well, Vashi, they didn't change the motion. They didn't change what's in the motion. They didn't change what they wrote in the motion. They just changed the title. Is if you write a book about Frankenstein and then you change the cover and you call it Cinderella. It's still a book about Frankenstein.
So because it's about Frankenstein, Canadians should go to the polls?
No, it's because that motion is absolutely unprecedented. It gives absolute powers to the members of this committee. The clear objective of this is to jam the government, is to paralyze the government in the middle of a pandemic when we see thousands of cases every day, so many people, so many lives that we've lost, so many people that are looking for a job, and our job, the government, is to be there for Canadians. And the Conservatives decided to play politics instead.
Explain to our viewers, if you could, Minister, how a committee that would be looking into what happened with We Charity, with this student grant program, how that precludes your government from doing the work it has been doing on the pandemic.
Well, the problem is not having a committee doing that, because we're suggesting a committee that would allow all members to ask all the questions they want and everything. The problem is what the powers, the immense powers it gives to the committee. It allows them to tell public servants, you know what, stop what you're doing now and answer all the questions, get us all the documents that we want, and those thousands of hours that you're spending now helping Canadians, you're going to spend it to do what we want, us the Conservatives playing partisan politics. It also forces the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, any minister, not invites, it forces them to go to that committee anytime they want. It could be every day, day after day, for hours and hours. Vashi, we have to concentrate our efforts on fighting the pandemics, not on this.
It sounds, though, like you really don't want that level of accountability. Like the Liberals don't want the ministers out there. They don't want those documents, those redacted documents provided. That's what the opposition says, right? This is about your government trying to avoid the accountability that this type of committee would force upon it.
If we were avoiding accountability, we would not be suggesting to create a committee, a normal committee. You know what? In that committee that we're suggesting to create, there's more members from the opposition. They would win every vote. Every time there's a vote, they have the capacity in the numbers to win it. So is that avoiding questions? No, it's the opposite. We're creating this very important committee.
But you would not be able to call, for example, the witnesses that they want. They would not be able to...
They can invite whoever they want.
But they would not be able to force them to appear, correct? I mean, in your version of the committee, the ministers who don't want to appear could decline the invitation. The Prime Minister could as well.
Yeah, but if you look at the track record of the government, I mean, our ministers, they show up when they're invited. The Prime Minister, when he's not invited, he show up. That's the real record of our government. We're there to answer the questions. But can you answer? I'll ask you a question. We're in the middle of this pandemic, a crisis, a health crisis, economic crisis, and the Conservatives decide that the best thing for them to do is to have this partisan motion. Why?
But I guess I feel as though you're framing it as a dichotomy, right? You're framing it as either or. Either you look into the allegations that have been leveled against your government, or you work on behalf of Canadians in the pandemic. I mean, can't both things happen? I mean, on this show, you're asking me a question. On this show, we cover both issues very thoroughly, right? I don't think one is at the exclusion of the other.
No, and by the way, you're doing a great job on your show. But you can do it if it's a normal committee with normal powers and that is not abusing. And this partisan, ultra-partisan committee created by the Conservatives is abusing all the powers, giving them extra powers. It doesn't represent at all the will of the people. If you look at the numbers of Liberals on that committee, they put a few Liberals there, tons of people from the opposition, not respecting the choice of Canadians when they voted last year. it's irresponsible. It's up to them to justify that. I'm not going to defend that.
And I'll be asking them questions too, but if it's irresponsible of them to be doing something that flies in the face, as you characterize it, of the concerns of Canadians when it comes to the pandemic, is it not equally irresponsible of your government to be putting this to essentially an election, to be ensuring the possibility that Canadians in the middle of a pandemic, most of whom can't even send their kids out for Halloween, might have to be taking part in an election?
And it's because we're thinking about all those people, those that lost their jobs and looking for another one. Families that are suffering from this, or seniors that are the ones that suffer the most, that we say we need to have the capacity to keep working for Canadians. And the Conservatives what they want to do through this motion, that it's, in my opinion, totally irresponsible, is to take away all the time that we have to concentrate on those efforts and the time that the public servants have. And instead of working on fighting this pandemic, it says, you will do what we want, us the Conservatives, in a very partisan way. It's irresponsible, Vashi.
But respectfully, you didn't answer my question, Minister. How is it responsible of your government to force an election over the creation of a committee in the middle of a pandemic that you are arguing should be of primary concern to everyone in Parliament? It
is of primary concern for the government, I can tell you that. I don't know for the Conservatives. But what can we do at the same time? You asked. We can walk and chew gum, right? As this famous expression. We can have the committee that we suggested, where the opposition have the majority. They can win every vote. They ask all the questions they want there, and have the government doing the job as is required by this situation. This is a crisis. We have to focus on Canadians. The Conservatives want to focus on us. We'll keep focusing on Canadians.
The NDP has proposed a middle ground that would not see the Liberals hold the chair position. Why not come to an agreement on that and thereby avoid an election?
We're discussing with everyone. Vashi, my door has always been open since day one. I gave my cell phone to all House leaders, and we're talking regularly. If there's interesting stuff, we'll discuss it for sure.
But are you close to an agreement, or is there a possibility of agreement before the confidence vote?
I'm discussing with everyone, and after that, it's up to them to make the decision. But I'd like to know from the Conservatives why, in this middle of the pandemic, the best thing they found, to do is bring this ultra-partisan motion that divides the Parliament.
And I can ask the Conservatives that, but my question is for you. Are you open to reaching an agreement with the NDP on what they've proposed, or do you insist that a Liberal must chair this committee?
Well, we're always open to discuss on everything, but it has to make sense. Now, what we're discussing is the vote tomorrow, is the Conservative motion tomorrow, right? And then we'll have plenty of time to discuss our own motion, which is extremely responsible, and it's offered to the others, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss depending on what happens tomorrow.
Well, certainly you could discuss those things prior to the vote on the Conservative motion.
Yeah, we're also discussing it, but the thing is that what happens tomorrow? Why are we debating today? The whole day, by the way. Actually, today, we could be asking questions. They could be asking questions on our seniors or health system or all of that.
They are asking other questions about China, for example.
They're spending the whole day, by the way, on asking questions on this committee. It's their decision, Bashi. They have to own it.
Okay, Minister, I've got to leave it there. I'm out of time, but thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Bashi.
Now we want to get the opposition's perspective. Joining me now to react, Michael Barrett, the Conservatives' ethics critic. He's in Ottawa. And Peter Julian is the NDP's House Leader. He joins us from New Westminster, British Columbia. Hello to both of you. Good to see you.
Good to see you. With you.
Mr. Barrett, I'll start with you. I just spoke with Minister Rodriguez, who continues to put the ball squarely in the Conservatives' court, says that this will, insists that this will go to a confidence vote because he feels that the government feels like this is all that the Conservatives are focused on to the exclusion of the pandemic, and that's not what Canadians want. Do you think Canadians are prepared to go to an election? Is your party prepared to go to an election over this?
The only one who's talking about going to an election is Justin Trudeau and his caucus. The official opposition, we have been very clear that what we're looking to do is take this issue out of the standing committees and deal with it at a special committee so that the standing committees can deal with the pandemic response. It's very simple, Vashi. If the Liberals want us to stop asking them questions about ethical law breaking, they need to stop breaking the rules.
So why not, let me just follow up with you quickly before I grab Mr. Julian, why not come to some sort of agreement, for example, with the NDP around their proposal, which tries to, I think, at least as they characterize it, strike a middle ground between what you're proposing, what the government wants, something that's maybe more broadly focused, but still allows, thanks to the makeup of the committee, you to go after all the documents that the opposition wants to see?
Look, we've talked with the other opposition parties, and the government was very aware of what we were proposing here. There were some changes that were requested in discussions with the NDP. We made those changes. The bottom line is that we want these documents. We want to be able to get the truth for Canadians. This is exactly what we promised that we were going to do when the Prime Minister prorogued Parliament. Parliament is back. They filibustered the committees. It's time to take it out of the hands of the Liberals and let's get the documents for Canadians.
Mr. Julian, this will, as Minister Rodriguez just said on our program, go to a confidence vote tomorrow. Mr. Singh, the leader of your party, Jagmeet Singh, was asked what position your party will take in that vote, and he did not offer a clear answer. Can you clear it up for Canadians watching tonight? Will you support the Conservatives' motion?
Well, first off, Justin Trudeau's been over the top on this. We are going through a pandemic. People are struggling. There are a lot of people that have not received the supports that they need, including people with disabilities. And for Justin Trudeau to take this over the top and to threaten an election is really irresponsible. But at the same time, Erin O'Toole could have looked, as the NDP motion did, to putting in place a smart approach to investigate these allegations of misspending. And instead, they had an over-the-top motion that Mr. O'Toole has been trying to amend through the course of the day. I guess what I'm saying is this is a failure of leadership, both from Justin Trudeau and Erin O'Toole. And Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have been saying we need an adult approach on this. We need to get answers for Canadians, but at the same time, we need to do it in a thorough and nonpartisan way. And that's the approach that Jagmeet Singh has been taking in the NDP caucus. We are talking to parties. We've been reaching out to people. And of course, tomorrow we'll have our caucus meeting, and then we will announce our decision.
So you haven't decided whether or not. I mean, it sounds like things are not going to change.
Our preference is that the NDP motion, that really is the compromise motion, is what is brought forward, and we are working to see if we can achieve that.
But my understanding is that wouldn't be in lieu of the vote that's going to happen tomorrow. That it seems intent that vote is going to happen. And you're just saying, I just want to be clear, you're saying that the NDP has not yet decided how it will vote when it comes to that motion.
Because we don't know how these discussions we're having tonight will go. And so we will be having those discussions. We'll be talking with caucus, and then we'll be announcing the decision.
Mr. Barrett, are the Conservatives part of those discussions? Do you see any which way? And I know you're going to say, well, the Liberals can make it, not a confidence motion. I take that point, and I asked Minister Rodriguez about that. But is there any way that the Conservatives would conceive of some set of actions to avoid the possibility of a vote that could lead to an election tomorrow? Like, are you willing to engage in those conversations to arrive at some kind of compromise?
Yeah, we've been very clear with what we're asking for. That's the release of these documents. We've given them weeks, if not months, to produce them, and they filibustered the committees once we came back from the prorogation, which they said wasn't to block the release of these documents and committee study. And so there were suggestions prior to this by the opposition parties individually, and the government didn't take anyone up on it. The first opposition day we've used to put forward this important motion, and we have had discussions with the other opposition parties, but now it's time for us to come together and hold the government to account for their misspending, for corruption. It's time that the Liberals are reminded that they don't have the majority that they used to shut down the SNC Lavalin investigations.
Respectfully, Mr. Barrett, though, I mean between now and the vote, is there anything the Conservatives are willing to do to try and avoid a vote that leads to an election? Well,
this morning, we took the step of putting in the actual motion that this isn't a question of confidence for the House. So the decision for it to become a confidence motion, the decision that this would lead to an election, rests with one person only, and that's Justin Trudeau. No one else is calling for an election. And so this is squarely at the feet of the Liberals, squarely at Justin Trudeau's feet. He needs to have that conversation with his caucus tomorrow if they're prepared to plunge Canadians into an election when Canadians are worried about their lives and their livelihoods. The official opposition is ready to go back to work at committees and deal with those issues. We also want to have a special committee to deal with these ongoing ethical problems in the Liberal caucus.
Just quickly before I move on to Mr. Julian and give him the final word, I take your point, Mr. Barrett, about the Liberals making this a decision, making the decision to make this a confidence vote. I wonder, though, if Canadians are as caught up in that kind of back and forth as you and I and Liberals and NDPs on the Hill are, and if instead they're just really worried in the middle of a pandemic about the possibility of an election and really not looking forward to something like that. And if there is a way, of some sort of compromise, no matter how, dug in each position seems right now, to avoid that in the spirit of what's best for Canadians.
We're operating in the spirit of what's best for Canadians. Absolutely. That's why, even at the Health Committee, trying to put forward, pandemic-related questions, and we've been filibustered on all fronts. We're at an impasse by the choice of the Liberals, and we've tried a few different approaches. We want to break the logjam, and frankly, the easiest way to do that is to remove this issue from the other committees. The decision on whether or not this forces an election is really Justin Trudeau's. It's not for Aaron O'Toole to say. This is very much a decision of Justin Trudeau's. And like my fellow Canadians, I don't look for an election to come from this tomorrow. I am worried about my community. I'm worried about people's health. I'm worried about their jobs and their businesses. And that's what we're focused on. And we're able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Justin Trudeau needs to do that, even if he's uncomfortable with the questions that are being asked.
Mr. Julian, I know you said that you'll see how these discussions proceed and you'll make a decision as a caucus together tomorrow. You heard Mr. Barrett's position. Mr. Rodriguez before him also did not seem movable. I asked him very specifically if he was willing to be open to a compromise with the NDP, willing to look at, for example, a change in the chair so that it isn't a Liberal. He would not specifically. He said he's open to everything, but there certainly didn't seem to be any commitment there. As it stands right now, what is your position? If things are as immovable as they seem on this motion tomorrow, are you willing to support the Conservatives and, in essence, because of the Liberals' decision here, the possibility of an election?
Well, I deplore Justin Trudeau taking this to the brink. I think Canadians really want to see all parties working together during a pandemic, that they want to get aside from partisan approaches that we've seen both from the Liberals and the Conservatives on this. They want all parties to work together. And I will say fairly that in the first few months of this pandemic, there was a real honest attempt to work together. And I think Canadians saw that. I think we need to get back to that. I would suggest to Mr. Trudeau he has to pull back from the cliff and the threats. And I suggest to the Conservatives the over-the-top motion that they presented this morning was inappropriate, that everybody needs to work together. I think that's what Canadians expect. And that's how we make sure we can get through this pandemic with nobody left behind.
If nothing changes, how will you vote tomorrow, Mr. Julian?
Well, I'm always an optimist that people will find a ground for compromise. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to see some movement tonight. But
you don't have a position on how you'd vote?
Well, you're asking me a hypothetical question. Where's the movement? What are people willing to do to get that to that spirit of compromise in the interests of Canadians? That's what the NDP will be pushing, and that's what Jagmeet Singh is pushing. We need to have one set of adults in the room that are working in the interests of all Canadians, and that's the role that we intend to serve.
Okay, I'm out of time. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It will be up to parliamentarians and the opposition to decide whether they want to make this minority parliament work or whether they've lost confidence in this government's ability to manage this pandemic.
I think Canadians see what's going on here. Threatening an election rather than being accountable for a prime minister who's already on his third personal ethics investigation. It's time for some accountability, and we're going to bring that.
I am not interested in posturing to find a way to put our country into an election. It seems to me, though, that the Prime Minister is looking for an excuse. So if there is an election, it is going to be because the Prime Minister has found a way to do it.
The NDP seems to have taken a bit of the wind out of the standoff on Parliament Hill. The government and the Conservatives have dug in on a vote to form a special committee chaired by the opposition to continue investigating the WE controversy. The government is threatening, has said it will be a confidence vote, but the NDP says it won't play that game. Who will win this round of pandemic politics? Time for the Power Panel to answer that question. In Toronto, Supriya Dwivedi, host of the morning show, Global News Radio, 640 Toronto. Also in TO, Shakir Chambers, senior consultant at Navigator. Political commentator and former NDP MP Françoise Boivin joins us from Gatineau. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I have to say, a week ago, I would have not have thought that we would be here on the verge of a confidence vote over this specific issue. Supriya, I'll start with you. How do you think this shakes out over the next 24 hours?
Geez, I mean, we're kind of playing a little bit with Schrodinger's confidence, right? Right now, insofar as it both exists and doesn't exist all simultaneously and all at the same time. Like, nobody can really predict the future. I think it depends on what the NDP decides to do and what, the other remaining Green MPs do. Even if the Bloc and the Conservatives, vote in favor of the motion, irrespective of the NDP and the other parties here, the Liberals are still up by 1 seat, I believe. My math, could be, right?
We checked it too. Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly one, but they're definitely, even if the NDP abstains, if they have the support of the Independents and the Greens, they will have more votes than the Bloc and the Conservatives. You're right.
Right. Yeah. And then so if you're just looking at this from like the electoral calculus perspective, I honestly don't think any of the parties really want to go to the polls unless you're the Bloc and you're in, good financial and good, resource shape to the polls. I'm not so worried about, how we'll conduct an election. I'm more worried and more annoyed, honestly, just that the parties couldn't necessarily make this work. And I think that'll end up, depressing turnout. And if you are the Liberals in this case, you do have to consider, with respect to the second wave, it is hitting urban and suburban areas a little bit harder than the rural areas, which the Conservatives tend to do quite well in. And so you'd have to factor in how that may end up depressing, their own vote turnout. And I would caution them not to get too high on what they're seeing right now in the polls, because I believe I've said this before, but the polls right now are kind of like your mom telling you that you're cool. I mean, it's all well and good, but ultimately that opinion doesn't really matter. And I think the polls for all governments, provincially and federally, are reflective of the fact that Canadians really just want to rally around their current government du jour to show that we're really all in this together. And so it really becomes this like tightrope walking act for both the government and the opposition here, because on the one hand, for the Liberals, it's very obvious what the opposition, the attack will be. It's that, well, what do they have to hide, right? But the rebuttal, I guess, for the Liberals, and this may be something that Canadians may be willing to listen to, is, well, why are they wasting time and resources during a pandemic?
Yeah, and the thing that I get is both those arguments, Shakir, in any sort of regular circumstance, it still surprises me. And I guess if I'm surprised, Canadians are kind of like, I would think, that this is ultimately going to be something that could determine an election.
Yeah, and I agree. I think I'm a little more optimistic here. I think the parties will find a way to kind of negotiate their way out of this and not head into an election. I think if you're the Conservatives, you see that you can put pressure on the government on the WE charity. You've seen what's happened before prorogation, where pushing this forward led to the cabinet shuffle, led to a finance minister stepping down, and all the other stuff that happened led to a new speech from the throne. But I think if you're the Liberals, you also look at this and you see that, we are the government in charge here, and we hope that if you want to move forward in an election, we're putting the onus on you to actually vote us out and go to an election. I think most Canadians right now don't even understand what's going on in this WE charity scandal. So I think if you are in the Conservative position, you need to be careful how you advocate for this. I think a lot of Canadians are sitting back and wondering what's going on. If you were to plunge the country into an election based on this, I think there might be consequences. I'm not sure who would bear the brunt of those consequences, but I'm not sure Canadians would be happy, especially as we go through this second wave of the pandemic. We're telling folks to stay home. We're telling kids not to trick or treat, but it's okay to go into an election. I'm not so sure that there's going to be a lot of positivity coming out of that.
Yeah, I feel like I think the way way that both you and Supriya laid out, I think there's risk to both the opposition and the government if they kind of plot ahead and continue to dig their heels in. I think that and Françoise, I'd love to hear what you say. I think there's risk to the opposition where they could seem obsessed with this issue at the expense of the pandemic, and certainly the Liberals are framing it that way. There's risk to the Liberals too, looking like they're trying to hide this stuff or shut down accountability on it. And either way, I just don't know if it overall increases Canadian sort of faith in politics.
Well, I'll just say this at the beginning. I ran many elections. I never felt on the ground that people were ecstatic to be into an election, except the politicians who were into it and the volunteers. Past that, not many people at any given time will say, hey, yay, we've got an election. Even when we have fixed election date, like we had the last one last year, you don't feel like that great enthusiasm. So that argument doesn't really impress me that much. I've been saying it before, and I'll repeat it. I still am convinced to my core that for the Liberals and the power to be inside the higher rank Liberal offices, they are evaluating, because political parties, it's for a lot of them, maybe not the NDP and the Greens, and even so, I'm sure it counts in their calculation for some of the moves that they make. But it's to gain power. It's to stay in power or gain power. And for the Liberals, the calculation right now is as such. I've never heard a minority Liberal government be so forceful in saying this is going to be a confidence vote. I thought I was reliving my years with Stephen Harper, and where he played his government as if he was a majority. That being said, I do believe some of the things I heard through the grapevines that they are feeling that now is probably their best time before income tax season coming next spring and so on and so forth, when people will realize that all this money they receive were not gifts. There's some fiscal implication attached to it. When some committees, whatever form they will take, remember, we had prorogation to avoid whatever the Liberals will tell you, it was to avoid continued scrutiny. And even if some people say, people have enough of the charity thing, there's other things. There's always new things that you learn, and they do not want that. They do not want to trip themselves. They want to go at their own will. That's why I find this is a game that if the NDP had played it differently and called the chicken game as it is and say, okay, we do not have confidence in you, and see if they change their wording.
Doesn't seem like they're going to do that.
But no, it doesn't seem they're going to do that, but they might sit people out. Now the Liberals might sit people out also. Who knows? I call it auto-tripping, and I don't think they'd be sad to go into an election right now after BC has their election.
Well, it certainly sets the stage for what will be a pretty interesting, I think, day tomorrow that we'll be following very closely. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.